Welcome to the first of this two-part video presentation on addiction. My name is Mike Mathers. I'm an addiction counselor and I have a private practice in Vancouver, BC called Wellness Evolved Counseling. For the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss the basics of addiction and how it develops to shed light on this complex issue. The second video will focus on the recovery process and how to help someone struggling with addiction. I'd like to acknowledge some of the people that have shaped my thinking on this topic, most notably Mark Hayden, who does a public health education series on addiction in Vancouver. A lot of the ideas I'm going to present are based on this series, and he's simply one of the best sources of information on addiction that I've ever encountered. You can watch his 6-part presentation on his website or attend a live presentation in Vancouver. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Gabor Mate and Bruce Alexander, as I will share some of their ideas and provide links to all three of these individuals at the end of this talk. Let's start with the common understanding of addiction that comes from the dictionary, which defines it as a compulsive need for and use of a habit-forming substance characterized by tolerance and by well-defined physiological symptoms upon withdrawal. Substance use becomes the central focus of life, and the person continues to use in spite of negative consequences. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, I think this tendency to define addiction in the simplest manner possible comes from the desire to just understand what is actually a very complex and multifaceted process. While it is correct that what we often observe in addiction is the presence of an irresistible urge, tolerance that grows with increased doses being required to get the same effect, craving with increased investment of time and energy to get at the substance, and symptoms of withdrawal, the truth is there is a spectrum of use that ranges from beneficial use to harmful use of substances. For example, prescription drugs can be life-enhancing medicines, or they can be substances used recreationally for purposes other than those which they were prescribed for, and thus misused and abused. The point is that all substances can be used or misused, and it really depends on the individual, the environment, and the context of use. I often think about this point in regards to chocolate cake. Okay, I often think about chocolate cake, period. One day, as I was thinking about chocolate cake, the phrase, "too much of a good thing," came to mind, and it made me wonder, is chocolate cake a good thing? Of course, it can be as an occasional treat. Chocolate cake has certainly brought me a lot of joy in life, but I've learned having children means a lot more opportunity to be eating chocolate cake. It's not complete without the little frosting there on top. If I ate all of the cake I was offered, it would definitely be way too much of a good thing. Not including toy cake at stuffed animal tea parties, because I've actually learned you're not permitted to ever refuse that. So this real cake example, it's not the end of the world yet. Even with this relatively harmless example, eventually I'd start suffering serious health consequences as a result of having too much of a good thing. Now, what about if I had type 2 diabetes? Oh, there goes my chocolate cake. So what about if I had type 2 diabetes and I was not managing my condition with exercise and an overall healthy diet? Eating cake in moderation might be too much of a good thing in this example. So the point is that substances themselves are not inherently good or bad. Rather, it's the reasons why we consume them, the quantity and the patterns of our consumption that determine whether there are benefits or harms. So I'll get back to this point a little bit later when talking about patterns of use. And before going on, I just want to point out that when I'm talking about substances, I'm also referring to behaviors that can be problematic, such as gambling, video game addiction, internet addiction, sex addiction, etc. The same brain circuitry is thought to be involved when people struggle moderating these types of behaviors. So I think anything said about substances can also be applied to understanding behavioral addictions as well. So as I already said, the common understanding of addiction does not always capture the harmful or problematic ways that people can relate to substances and behaviors in their lives. For example, sometimes people can struggle with substance use without there being withdrawal symptoms from physical dependence on the substance. So I'd now like to outline some different models of addiction to illustrate how the individual is impacted as addiction develops. A little knowledge about various models of addiction is important because people want to be able to understand it so that they can see when they themselves or a loved one might have crossed a line or be on the verge of crossing a line into addiction. There's good and bad news about this. The bad news is that addiction is not easily labeled or categorized because of the variety of ways that substances can ensnare people and the different ways people can suffer once they're in it. Just because someone's able to hold down a job while using on the weekends does not mean they don't have a substance misuse problem. This can be challenging because family members often want a yes-no answer when it comes to asking the question, is my loved one addicted? The good news, just as there are multiple paths and forms of harm in addiction, there are similarly almost an infinite variety of paths back to health and well-being. Getting well or developing a treatment plan for addiction is not a one-size-fits-all proposition. In video number 2, I'll give a bit more information about how to get help in different forms of treatment. So starting with a brief history on the models of addiction, the first one is the moral model. In the moral model, addiction is seen to be the result of a person's weak character, lack of willpower, and their own bad choices. The individual is seen as capable of making conscious choices about their substance use. The moral model says willpower is the problem. However, it is not that simple, as often there are underlying mental health issues that drive problematic substance use. Depression, anxiety, and trauma are all factors that impact a person's vulnerability for the development of addiction. Furthermore, there are skills people can learn, such as positive and effective communication strategies, emotional self-regulation skills. This just means being able to calm oneself down and manage feelings without being constantly overwhelmed by stress, and general problem-solving skills that protect against addiction and help with recovery. So clearly it's not simply about willpower, as the moral model says. Addiction does not persist due to a lack of willpower as much as from a lack of skill power. No more rhymes, and I mean it. The disease perspective is the next model. This was developed around 1935, 2 years after the repeal of Prohibition, the same year Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA, began. The primary assertion is that the problem of abuse is best seen as a progressive condition or disease. So the shift to this model had beneficial impacts for users, as it meant they were not morally responsible for their condition any more than someone with a hereditary physical illness would be. Hence, this model justified more humane treatment than people were afforded under the moral approach. The disease model embraces the idea that addictions are a medical problem and treatment is therefore necessary. This approach was an improvement on the moral model because blame was no longer placed on the character of the addicted person, but rather on a genetic predisposition combined with excessive and prolonged use that resulted in the disease. 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, AA and NA, take the disease model position, and the solution is identification and confrontation of the facts of the disease and lifelong abstinence. A great many people have recovered from the suffering of addiction through this philosophy and the support of caring peers. The next model is the biopsychosocial spiritual model. This is a popular contemporary position taken by many public health programs as it involves a holistic approach, taking into account a person's biological predispositions, their psychological functioning, their social environment, finally, their spiritual needs. And you can see some of these characteristics on the following picture. The benefit of this model is that it tries to look at the whole picture, so a single characteristic alone doesn't mean much. For example, if you have a parent who struggled with alcohol, that doesn't automatically mean you will as well. It's a risk factor, but it's the number of these characteristics and the strength or frequency of them in a person's life that leads to the vulnerability for addiction. According to this model, the reasons why people become addicted are complex, and they include genetic, biochemical, psychological, social, and spiritual factors. The more severe the level of risk factors, the more vulnerable the individual becomes for developing a problematic relationship with substances. A couple more comments on understanding models of addiction. First, from Gabor Mate, a well-known Vancouver doctor, writer, and addiction specialist. In his renowned book, In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts, about his work with addicted clients in Vancouver's downtown east side. He says, addiction is a complex condition, a complex interaction between human beings and their environment. We need to view it simultaneously from many different angles, or at least, while examining it from one angle, we need to keep the others in mind. Addiction has biological, chemical, neurological, psychological, medical, emotional, social, political, economic, and spiritual underpinnings, and perhaps others I haven't thought about. To get anywhere near a complete picture, we must keep shaking the kaleidoscope to see what other patterns emerge. End quote. So this highlights the complexity of addiction. It's overdetermined, which means that it has multiple causes. Not a neat and tidy answer, but an important truth to keep in mind as we seek understanding. And on the next page, he goes on to say, dependence can also be understood as a powerful attachment to harmful substances or behaviors. And this definition gives us a clearer picture of addiction. The addict comes to depend on the substance or behavior in order to make himself feel momentarily calmer or more excited or less dissatisfied with life. And then he goes on to quote an Episcopalian chaplain at the University of Chicago who said, the heart of addiction is dependency, excessive dependency, unhealthy dependency, unhealthy in the sense of unwhole, dependency that disintegrates and destroys. A pretty powerful description. I recommend this book, but also want to caution people that while it's a valuable read, it's not an easy emotional experience to get through due to the intense stories about people's pain. I also want to share some words of a Vancouver psychologist named Bruce Alexander, who wrote an incredible book called The Globalization of Addiction. In this book, he talks about the fundamental human need for belonging, or feeling like one is part of a greater community. He says this is experienced as a sense of identity because stable social relationships provide people with a set of duties and privileges that define who they are in their own minds. He calls this psychosocial integration, and says that when present, it makes human life bearable and even joyful at its peaks. On the other hand, he says, a lack or loss of psychosocial integration, which he calls dislocation, denotes psychological and social separation from one's society. And dislocation's been given many names, perhaps the most familiar being alienation or disconnection. Now, bringing these ideas together, Gabor Mate's idea of addiction as disconnection from self, and Bruce Alexander's thoughts on addiction as dislocation from a greater community. We have the elegantly simple definition of Mark Hayden, who states, addiction is an attachment disorder. Substance abuse is any drug use that breaks healthy connections with self, family, friends, and society. For me, this definition is simple, and yet it makes a lot of sense. We're hardwired to need people. Our growth and development, which is a lifelong process, is dependent on our relationships with others. We're born in a pretty helpless state, and our brains are shaped by the quality of the response that we received, or unfortunately in some cases did not receive from our caregivers. The feeling of belonging underlies so many positive experiences, and when people lack this feeling inside of themselves, they can become prone to seek relief from substances. This view says that the addictive process takes people out of healthy relationships with others and tricks them into thinking they can get those attachment needs met, or better met, through a close relationship with a bottle, a pill, a powder, or a behavior. So it's important to realize that the process of addiction involves the brain's reward pathways. The parts of the brain that motivate us to want to repeat experiences that we feel are good for us. This part of the brain is basically being hijacked in addiction. And the substance comes to be seen as something that is needed for survival. Acquiring or using one substance takes on the same level of importance as attaining food or water in the brain of the individual who's afflicted. So addiction is not a state of lacking motivation, as sometimes is commonly thought. People are highly motivated when addicted, but they just happen to be motivated towards things that are not serving them in the long term. And I think this is important for family members to realize, because a loved one may seem selfish or uncaring when they're addicted to substances, yet what is happening is that their brain has mistakenly learned to value something above their relationships with others. And that something is not really good for them, like they feel at their core that it must be. So, addiction is an attachment disorder, and primarily about disconnection and dislocation. And this means that healing is then about reconnecting with self and others. Simply put, developing positive relationships with healthy people, places, and things can bring people back to balance. Mark Hayden says that in recovery we need new playmates, playgrounds, and playthings. And this highlights the importance of social support and the role for family and friends in helping the individual change. Figuring out what each unique person needs to reconnect with the self and others in a healthy way is often what treatment is about. So this journey of recovery can be seen as a spiritual journey, in the sense of it being a path towards reconnection with self, with others, and with a sense of purpose or meaning in life. It's easy to say all of that, but the hard truth of the brain being hijacked through prolonged substance use is that recovery takes time, effort, and proper support. Setbacks can happen, but with proper support and motivation, these can become opportunities for growth as opposed to experiences of failure. And in the second video, I will be sharing information and discussing strategies that can help in this regard. Now I'd like to talk about patterns of substance use to illustrate how things can get progressively worse for people. The process of addiction usually progresses gradually, which can make it hard for people to recognize the problem. As you can see on this graph, often people start using drugs because substances make them feel good, as illustrated by the line that goes from normal to up. Up simply meaning that when people start using drugs, they often initially feel euphoria, confidence, joy when they use. However, as you can see over time, the shift can happen where they end up using so that they won't feel bad. On the right hand side, it shows that by the time the problem has fully developed, the person feels down most of the time, meaning they could be generally depressed, anxious, angry, or pessimistic about life when not using substances. And they only get temporary relief from those feelings by using their drug of choice. Problematic substance use can sneak up on people as the brain starts to change and tricks the person into thinking that the mounting costs of their substance use are worth the diminishing benefits. This is often called rationalization. People begin doing this first with themselves and then with others, and then sometimes this gets called lying or denial. If someone has a lot of pain, whether physical or emotional, this can also impact how quickly addiction takes hold. If the individual does not have a lot of positive strategies for dealing with physical and emotional pain, then this can also make them vulnerable to getting caught up in this addiction. There's a spectrum for patterns of substance use that can move from experimentation through to social use, then on to what would be called instrumental use, and finally to habitual and compulsive substance use. And as you can see from this graph, the more serious consequences to the person's health usually start to mount up in the habitual and compulsive patterns of use. Binge use is another category, but unlike the others, it's not defined by the frequency of use, which makes it a tricky one to assess severity for. I'll explain at the end how the research shows that binge use can carry significant risks to the individual's overall well-being. So the first pattern is experimentation, and this refers to the first few times a person tries alcohol or other drugs. There's a decision process. People may decide to start experimenting for a variety of reasons, including boredom, curiosity, to gain relief from depression and anxiety, or to belong with peers. The needs that lead people to experiment with drugs are not in themselves unhealthy. As I already mentioned, it's quite healthy to want to belong and to attach to others. Gordon Neufeld and Gabor Mate have written a great parenting book about this issue called Hold On to Your Kids, which highlights how important a strong attachment is. Otherwise, kids can start taking their social and developmental cues from each other, leading to what they call a peer orientation. And as you might guess, this is not the ideal way for development to proceed. In the experimentation phase, risks are often ignored and there's no thoughts about the long-term use of drugs. And the dangers listed here are often a result of people being naive. Due to the fact that this is a new type of experience, they don't know what to really expect or how to manage risks. The next pattern is social use, and this is generally done in social settings. It's one factor in the event, but not the main purpose of the gathering. And experimentation often leads to social use since social use is not only accepted but promoted or even pressured, both for adolescents and adults alike. Furthermore, experimentation and social use can set the stage for instrumental use. The instrumental pattern of substance use is about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Substance use is a very effective short-term solution for changing how we think, feel, or act. This doesn't mean that drug use is a good long-term strategy for most people, but the point is that substances can give people a feeling of power and control. And this is a basic human need, especially for those who have had their sense of power or control taken away from them. The reason why this is not an effective long-term strategy is that the feelings or thoughts people are seeking to manage or control or change often return once the effects wear off, and this sets up the pattern of seeking to return to a desired and less painful state. In this stage, people are not using socially, but they're attempting to reach a place where they can achieve a feeling of relief from distress. Next, we have the habitual pattern of use. In this phase, drinking or drugging is now creating serious problems in one or more areas of a person's life. Although the person still has some choice about using, I should say that the person still has some choice about using in this pattern. Symptoms of dependency might begin to appear here. Chemicals begin to dominate in life as the person's lifestyle becomes progressively centered on using substances as a means of coping. Former relationships might start to fade. People try and convince themselves that their substance use makes them happier, despite the mounting contrary evidence. And there's two main events that happen here. Users don't return to normal when not using, and tolerance develops, so they need more to achieve the same effect. And they might even start to notice they rarely get back the high that they used to feel. By the time the individual is in the compulsive pattern of use, they're experiencing an overwhelming physical need and or psychological compulsion to use. Choice is greatly diminished at this stage, as the area of the brain that helps us plan and tolerate short-term pain for long-term gain has been compromised. Substance use is now necessary to achieve something close to normal. This is the right-hand side of that previous graph, where people are feeling sick most of the time and only gain temporary relief when they're using. And the individual is often falling short of getting back to feeling anywhere close to as well as they used to feel. All actions become about obtaining or using drugs, befriending, dating, becoming dealers themselves. Arrogance or defensiveness might be how people start acting in this stage. And this often represents the unconscious defense of feeling a loss of control in their lives. Approximately 10% of the population are vulnerable to this stage of addiction. So earlier I said binge use was going to be discussed separately, and the reason for this is that people often think this type of pattern of substance use does not make someone an addict or alcoholic. It involves long periods of no use and short periods of intense use. This is the weekend warrior. And this pattern of use can increase risk of a number of severe consequences, as binging tends to become more and more frequent over time, so that a severe problem sometimes can sneak up on people. In some industries or pockets of society, this type of substance use is approved or even encouraged. Binge use can be a huge stressor for families because a parent engaged in this type of use is extremely unpredictable, as no one knows which side of the person is going to show up at any time. Binge use can also be associated with higher rates of hostility and aggression, arrest, domestic violence, work problems, and hospital admissions when compared to heavy, steady users. Because it does not look the same as habitual or compulsive patterns of use, it can also be easier for people to maintain their denial about the severity of the problem. I hope you have found this information to be helpful. The first step towards change, or helping someone else change, is understanding how addiction can develop. If there's one point I want you to take away from this presentation, it's the view of addiction as an attachment disorder. As I explained, we're hardwired to need other people. Social relationships help us to grow and to thrive. A healthy attachment sphere involves being related to a wide variety of people for a wide variety of reasons. Knowing people of different ages and backgrounds who share our interests in a variety of diverse ways. In addiction, it's the variety of these sustaining relationships that tend to fall away. People might still have friends who they use drugs with, but that is starting to be the main activity that bonds them with others. And often, addiction of this sort ends in isolation. And this is why it can be difficult for people to recover, as connection is what's needed for healing, yet the capacity for connection is exactly what gets diminished through substance use disorders. Furthermore, addiction at the core often has less to do with substances and more to do with the avoidance of unpleasant emotions. This is why Gabor Mate says that to understand another person and the journey they are on, we should be asking not why the addiction, but why the pain. It can be challenging to open ourselves to pain, whether our own or the pain of others. But if healing is what we truly seek, then it is a crucial step. Trying to shift to an attitude of curiosity about thoughts, feelings, and behavior, rather than an attitude of judgment, is a helpful way to begin the change process and start to develop understanding. Thanks for your time, and please watch video number 2 for more specific information on recovery and what you can do to help yourself or someone else change addictive patterns of behavior.